Rohan, can we think of a different way of constitution making? I mean, in your submission, you have mentioned that it is anchored to the cabinet, the president, the government, and certainly that is perhaps the view of many in this country. But constitution making is about peoples, and peoples, I would argue, and have many others, need to include peoples. South Africa is a case in point, as have been many other examples. Where are the people's voices in this process to date? And if you also agree with that submission, how can we get them more involved? Or is it possible in this architectonics of politics in Sri Lanka?
No, my reference to the cabinet and to people in the cabinet was purely talking about the current reality and the political reality.
But that's the rub, isn't it?
You're perfectly right. I mean, constitutional reform and constitution making is really an exercise that the people engage in. I mean, even in the Supreme Court hearing on the president's term, it was very interesting that two of the president's counsel who intervened and came up with this amazing argument that the president's term should begin in November 2011, not 2010, kept on talking about the will of the people and the sovereignty of the people. But I think it's important to remember that a constitution is meant to reflect the will of the people, and the people then decide through their constitution what the principles of governance are going to be, what powers are going to be given to their leaders, what powers are going to be retained by themselves for their own protection. Now, I think the problem with Sri Lanka's constitution making is that both our so-called republican constitutions, both our autochthonous constitutions, have not involved the people at all. If you look at the 1972 constitution, it was basically a constitution designed by the United Front government for the United Front government, and the same with the 1978 constitution. And why was that? It was because both the United Front and UNP governments had two-thirds majorities, and they could basically adopt a constitution which was in their interests and suited their political and economic objectives, what Neelan Tiruchelvam has called the instrumental use of constitutions. And for the last 10 or 15 years, we've been talking about a need for a new constitution, and we were hoping that a new constitution would be adopted through a more legitimate type of mechanism and involve the people. And I'm extremely concerned that after the re-election of President Rajapaksa, several government leaders have been talking about introducing a new constitution through the mechanism of a constituent assembly without a two-thirds majority. And I think that that would be unconstitutional, and that is not the route that we should go down.
Let me actually backtrack my own question. The legitimacy of constitution making, the unconstitutional nature of your submissions, surely it must result in some kind of public uproar. And earlier guests on my program have suggested that the lack of that suggests that Sri Lanka is actually a country of voters, not citizens, that our civic consciousness, our idea of a Sri Lankan identity, our interaction with our constitution is severely limited in our understanding and our approach to it. How would you respond to that?
I agree. I think everyone who talks about Sri Lanka's democratic, strong democratic traditions points to the fact that we have had regular elections and the voter turnout has been reasonably high. But the problem is that people tend to go to sleep in between elections, and they sort of keep up all their frustration and anger until the next election, which is not necessarily a good thing for democracy. So I do think that this is a problem. I mean, look at the 17th Amendment. We had an election which was flawed mainly because the 17th Amendment was not operational. Lots of the independent institutions, therefore, were not in place. Dayananda Dissanayaka failed to assert the powers that he had under the savings clause, which allowed, ironically, only the Election Commission to be operational under the 17th Amendment to the Constitution. And there doesn't seem to be much anger at all. And what is really quite disturbing is now you get several letters to the press justifying the non-implementation of the 17th Amendment to the Constitution. And I must say the justifications for non-implementation have been absolutely bizarre. You have Due Gunasekara saying we can't implement the 17th Amendment because there are flaws in it. My gosh, most of our laws have flaws in them, but they are implemented. You have S.L. Gunasekara coming up with this bizarre argument that the 17th Amendment should not be implemented because it's detrimental to the Sinhalese. And I think that argument is itself flawed, just ensuring that out of 10 members of the Constitutional Council, 3 or 4 represent minorities is certainly not something that is detrimental to the Sinhalese. And then you have G.L. Pires coming up with this bizarre argument that the 17th Amendment violates the sovereignty of the people because it weakens the power of the president. The Supreme Court of Sri Lanka actually dealt with this question when the 17th Amendment was introduced and held that the sovereignty of the people was not affected at all. And I would have thought that having independent institutions that could be free from political interference would enhance the sovereignty of the people rather than retard it. So you have these amazing arguments that are put forward to justify the non-implementation of an entire chapter of our Constitution, and people don't seem to be outraged, people don't seem to be angry at all. And I think that's very, very disappointing.
Going back to the issue of federalism, I mean, the debate has died down. There was an active debate, again, pro and against it. You were center and forward in the debate, Rohan. Do you see it re-emerging in the future as something that animates this discussion and debate about constitutional reform, or do you see that with the majoritarian democracy, and certainly that which you have spoken of in this program alone, that it is a non-starter?
Well, I've been a federalist for more than 25 years, and I still believe that the best way forward is to have a federal constitution. It's a way of also ensuring that the government, the central government, doesn't have too much power. There are all sorts of governance and conflict resolution arguments in favor of federalism. But you're perfectly right. I think the mood has changed so much with the defeat of the LTTE and with this kind of Sinhala majoritarian triumphalism that it may not be the time to actually push for federalism. But I think we need to push for a political solution to the conflict. And during the election, when I met people from diverse backgrounds, I was struck by the fact that lots of them recognized that the military defeat of the LTTE was not the end of the story, that there needed also to be political reform. Otherwise, the problem could resurface or whatever. And I do think that we've got to talk in that kind of language. We've got to talk about, say, 13th Amendment plus. We've got to use some of the early documents that emerged from the APRC process as the beginning. And it's going to be tough, but I think it's something that we need to do.
You know,